Following the previous video, this video now creates an opportunity for you to test your understanding of field, tenor and mode, as well as giving some practical examples. We're going to be having a look at some different types of texts and talking through their contextual features. This is our first example. Can you remember that thing we did yesterday in class that was like so crazy? I can't believe you thought you could throw that thing at the guy in the front. So when we think about field in this, ask yourself, how accessible is this information? Does it make sense to me? Or does it require some prior knowledge in order for me to make meaning from the text? In regards to tenor, ask yourself about how casual or formal was it? Does it feel like it's conversational, like we're talking to a friend? Or does it feel like a more formal element where someone's conveying objective information to us? For the third element, consider the construction of sentences and think about the density of the text. How many sentences are we looking at in this case? And are they complex and have a lot of information? Or do we find that sentences only contain a single or really limited piece of information? The results for this text are as follows. You can see that largely it was a highly inaccessible text, even though the language was very casual and very spoken. And this just goes to show how context can sometimes be quite complex in the way that it works. Because even though we could understand every word that was there, the subject matter relied on a high degree of prior knowledge and quite specialised knowledge that isn't accessible to anyone who wasn't there. Our second example reads, the adoption of modern foreign policy since the Tampa affair has seen a divide in public opinion in regards to the refugee treatment in Australia. So if we're considering the field in this case, ask yourself, is there information here that is assumed? Are there elements here that we're assumed to know about? So for example, it makes reference of the Tampa affair. Do we know what that is? Since the Tampa affair gives a timestamp on something, but if we don't know when that was, then we can't necessarily quantify where this change or adoption of modern policy has actually happened. In regards to the tenor, we can see in this case that the information is being given to us relatively objectively. While there is some bias in the way that it's written, it doesn't feel like a friend talking to us. It almost feels like something we would read in a newspaper or a more formal publication. So it seems to have that structure to it. In regards to mode, we can see that firstly, this is all one sentence, so it's quite a complex sentence. And as well as that, it's got a lot of elements of information to it. It talks about the adoption of modern foreign policy, but then at the same time, it also requires us to think about the Tampa affair and the relationship between those two things. It also hints at a divide in public opinion, and then it also talks about refugee treatment in Australia. So there's really four key elements of information within one short, simple sentence. As a result, we can see that we're really looking at this piece on that far end of the continuum. Our last example reads, today we're looking at the likelihood of a Liberal leadership challenge within the next 2 months, which recent information has revealed to be less likely than 2 months ago, but still possible. This is an interesting piece of text, and what we'll find is that there are elements of understanding that we can take from it, but then there are also things that require us to have prior knowledge. For example, it talks about the likelihood of a Liberal leadership challenge. While we don't necessarily understand perhaps the party politics behind it, we can understand that there's likely to be a leadership challenge within the next 2 months. It talks about recent information revealing this to be less likely than 2 months ago, but we don't necessarily know what information it's pertaining to. So in terms of field, this is a good opportunity to demonstrate something that has elements of accessibility. We do get the broader picture when we read it. It's not inaccessible to us, but at the same time, there's a lot of details to it that don't necessarily make sense without prior knowledge. In regards to tenor, we do see some inclusive personal language, like today we are looking at, as though we're looking at it together, and that creates a sense of relationship or connection between the writer and the reader, which is a more casual sort of element. That power distance isn't quite as great. That being said, that only really happens on one occasion, and the rest of it has a bit more formality to it. So we can see some elements there of more personalised, character-driven language, along with some more objective language as well. So again, there's a bit of a mix. Similar to our other piece, we could also see that this is again one sentence, but unlike the previous one which had 4 elements of information kind of compacted into quite a small area, a lot of this is sort of quite circumstantial detail which supports the main body of evidence. So while it's not completely written or not as written as the previous sentence, it still has some written components to it. Hopefully without too much surprise, you should see that this text puts us somewhere in the middle. With this in mind, we're now going to apply our focus on context to the article of Assassin's Creed Origins. In class, we spent a bit of time with people doing this individually, and I would recommend doing that to align your understanding of each of the areas of field, tenor, and mode against what I'm about to say. So you can pause this video if you like, but otherwise I'm going to be talking through my evidence. Some key questions to think about in regards to field include: how accessible is the text? Does it use specialised language? Would anyone understand it? Would my grandmother understand it? Or do you need to have played the game in the past? Do you need to be familiar with the franchise? As you read through the article, ask yourself some of these key questions. What are the assumptions that underpin this? And what might this say about the intended audience? In considering the field, you can see I've got a range of different pieces of evidence here that I've highlighted within the piece which show where assumptions are made. Now you notice the whole thing isn't highlighted because there are elements there that do make sense, and as well as that, even if I'd never played the game before, I do still get a relatively broad understanding of the nature of the piece of writing. For example, I get the sense that this person seems to like or be hopeful for the release of the game, even without necessarily understanding the specific details of the piece. So that's quite significant. When it comes to tenor, we really want to ask ourselves about the relationship between the reader and the writer. If there's elements of relationship, for example, slang or personal language, is it directed specifically to us? Does it call us you as the reader? Is it personally shown, I think or I found? All of these elements create aspects of personality in the writing. And what you're really asking yourself here is how much personality is actually present in the piece. In this case, what we can see is that there are elements of more formal and less formal components. For example, the opening is quite objective. It talks about the franchise in quite a passive way and gives us an impression as to what this article is about. We get a sense there that it's more formal, but then later on it goes into talk about the demo I played, which is more personal and more deliberately subjective and biased. So that gives us a less formal sort of element. Well, interestingly enough, we see that texts are rarely one or the other, but in this case it's a clear combination of both, and that's not an uncommon thing in something like an article that has an informational sort of section as well as a review sort of subjective section to it as well. Finally, we're looking at the mode. We're asking ourselves, is the text more written or more spoken? A couple of key questions we can ask in this case are about the vocabulary that it uses, the sentence composition, and how dense the text is. In having a look at the text through this lens, we can see that there's some sections that are actually very dense. So the first couple of sentences of the piece actually imply a lot of interesting information. It starts by saying Assassin's Creed's fans who've been part of the series from Altair through to the Fry siblings. So there's a bit of information in there first. It's talking about the fans and then it's categorizing those fans. And then it goes on to say that they're eagerly anticipating. So we're, alright, so this is kind of where they're at. But then it goes into say Bayek's formation of the Brotherhood, which is another reference to another piece of information. And then it talks about Assassin's Creed Origins being the game. Now, interestingly enough, Assassin's Creed Origins, as we can tell from the title, is actually the focus of this. So why wouldn't they have started by orientating the sentence around that? Well, the answer is that in written language, we actually can be more creative in our construction of sentences, whereas in spoken language, we tend to be much more straightforward and predictable. We don't want people to have to kind of stop and think about what we've just said and process it. We actually want it to be as easily absorbed as possible. But we can see more conversational and spoken areas down here. When he talks about the demo I played and uses language like meets up, it's actually quite sort of dumbed down, simple language in quite short, simple sentences. We also see some elements like a rhetorical question in there, which is largely a spoken device because it relies on timing and the sound of the thing. We've got no problem reading this, but often when we read a rhetorical question, we sort of hear it at the same time because of our exposure and understanding of spoken language. The end of the article, however, is much more written, so it ends with a much more spread diversity of language, saying things like lackluster and stellar and using things like conventions and modernizing. It mixes up its language, so there's not a lot of repetition of language, which there often can be in a spoken text. And as well as that, we've gone back to that density that we saw in the early part. With all of these things considered, you can see that for this article, I've suggested that it's slightly more inaccessible than it is accessible. I've said that the tenor's about in the middle, and that the spoken again is sort of in the middle, maybe a little bit more written than spoken. So I've used this analysis to really break down and understand the nuance of what makes the writing style of this article so significant. And through that, I'm able to really understand the components that form the voice of the writer. Now that I've done this, I'm going to try and replicate this context in my own writing.